Second Peter chapter 2. We've made our way down to where we're thinking about verse 10. Verse 10 comes after a kind of three illustrations from history that are set up in an if-then kind of thing. We've got if the angels who rejected God were kicked out of heaven, if the world was judged and the flood came and Noah and his family were the only ones saved then, and if Lot, a righteous man, and Peter reveals more about Lot's inner thinking, inner working, inner thoughts than I think anywhere else in Scripture. Lot and his family were rescued from a horribly evil society that was destroyed by God. If those things are so, in verse 9, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. Punishment is surely coming for the unrighteous. And then he goes on in verse 10. This is especially true of those who follow the corrupt desires of the flesh and despise authority. Now, last time we talked a little bit about this idea of corrupt desires of the flesh. And I want to come back to it and maybe open it up a little bit more, unpack it a little. There are essentially two ways that this idea of the flesh is interpreted and understood in Scripture. The first is its most literal meaning, the flesh, as in the flesh, which really, in terms of how that word is used in Scripture, has to do with the physical aspect with mankind. Okay, that's perhaps its broadest interpretation. And yet here, there's a Greek word that is used that is, it could be, and other translations actually in this spot, they do translate it, they do interpret it to mean these are the evil desires of our sinful nature. Well, here, Peter is not talking about the literal human flesh. He's talking about that second kind, the evil desires of sinful nature. And he says, this is especially true. What is that the unrighteous are held for punishment on the day of judgment. And this punishment is especially true of those who follow the corrupt desires of the flesh. Okay. I'm tempted to say most, but I don't have a deep enough background to be able to, go that far with it. But I think many of the desires that we have begin or are originally beneficial. But when a desire, a God-given desire, is bent out of its original intent or put in the wrong context, it gets corrupted. Go clear back to the very first temptation. When Satan came to Eve as a serpent in the garden, he did a couple of things that fit with what Peter writes here. First of all, he appeals to what I think is a legitimate desire. He appealed to Eve's curiosity in that he said, wouldn't you like to be as smart as God, to know the difference between, and wouldn't See, God has told you not to eat this fruit because He doesn't want you to be as smart as Him. All right? What was the desire? It was a desire that I think is bound up in curiosity, and the function of curiosity is to help us discover. It's for our growth, right? If you're not ever curious, you'll never pursue anything for discovery. I mean, I think that's a legitimate desire. I think it's God-given. And Satan goes, boop, and he twists it. He bends it. He carries it over. He pulls it over into the wrong context. Eve, she takes it hook, line, and sinker. A simple, I think it's a simple, I think every man probably can relate to this. I'm not so sure whether women can, but the principle is clear for both. But for most men, when a man sees a beautiful woman, whatever he believes is beautiful, there's something in him that is sparked. Our interest is drawn. Now, I don't believe that's a sin. I don't want to blame God for my weakness, but I'm not even sure that's a weakness. You see, God created men to be sexually stimulated by visual encounters, right? We are visually stimulated, generally. There are men that would not be true of, but they're an incredibly small minority. The rest of us, the visual will stimulate us. Now, there's a reason for that. And the reason is because without some kind of sexual stimulation, the human race would never have made it past Adam and Eve. There has to be some kind of igniter for, I'm going to just, I don't want to make this rated R or anything, but there's got to be an ignition point for the desire to engage in sexual intercourse, which results in babies. This is part of God's design. Now, what I do with that initial desire, that's where sin or not will happen. If this interest, this attractiveness of what I would consider a beautiful woman, everybody has their own standards, but okay, what I do with that's where sin either happens or doesn't happen, right? See that there are times when a person can be accidentally introduced or accidentally shown pornography. This happens. It does, but that's not the majority. That's not the biggest part of the problem with pornography in our culture. Pornography is very accessible, and men seek it out. That's a problem. To have this interest in an attractive female form, that's an original desire, but when it is taken out of its appropriate designated context, that's when sin happens. That's when a desire is corrupted. It is not wrong for me to have that desire for my wife. That's right. It is wrong for me to permit this initial attractiveness to capture my imagination and draw me off. That's what sexual lust is. Okay, the point is, I could go on a tirade about pornographic society and a pornographic culture. I'm not going to, but I'm going to just leave it at this. When a desire is corrupted, that's when sin happens. Sin is the result of a corrupted desire, and Satan is a master at corrupting desire. Corruption we're familiar with corruption. It's not like a word we don't really get. It has to do with fruit and vegetables that go bad, meat that goes bad, dead bodies, they rot. See, the rotting thing that's corruption. And we also, all of us that work with computers, we're very familiar with the idea of corruption, right? When a file gets corrupted, it can ruin your entire operating system. And it only takes one digit, 0 or 1, to be broken or bent to destroy the entire operating system of a computer. The corruption. I think many of us, maybe all of us, have had a corrupted file, and it's kind of frustrating. Okay. Corrupt desires of the flesh. When a desire is corrupted, when it's taken out of its God-ordained context, it produces death. That's what James says. It starts, we're tempted when each one of us are dragged away and enticed by our own desires. And then desire, when it gives birth to sin, and sin gives birth to death. That's just how it works. So a corrupted desire gives birth to sin, and sin gives birth to death. And then Peter says, so the judgment, and I take it to be the surety and maybe even the severity of judgment is strong for people who follow the corrupt desires of the flesh and despise authority. These two things go together. One of the reasons that we so often follow the corrupt desires of the flesh is that we have, to some degree, we think of it as disregarding the authority of God in our life, but Peter's words are probably more true. We despise authority. That's a simple thing to interpret. People don't want anybody telling them what to do. I grew up in the 60s. I graduated from high school in 1971, so most of my growing up was in the 60s. And a lot of sociologists say the cultural tipping point in America was 1964 to 1968 and all of that. And I remember being a part of a generation that really thought if you're an authority, you being an authority gives us every reason to disregard, disrespect, ignore, or out and out despise your authority, right? Funny, now I'm part of the demographic that is, in most cases, the authority. It's crazy how that all works, isn't it? Well, anyway, that I grew up in that generation is no excuse. It doesn't give me a get out of jail free card for my despising authority. Ultimately, the ultimate authority is God. And when I reject his authority, I don't know that there's a big difference between rejecting his authority and despising it. See, that's the second thing that Satan, in the form of a serpent, presented to Eve. He led her to doubt God's authority, and by saying, so did God really say that you would die if you ate this fruit? What is this death thing anyway? We've never seen it. What's that about? He planted a seed, and Eve, that's all she needed. It's like he threw the grenade without pulling the pin because he knew Eve would pull the pin. And she did. She ate the fruit. If she had firmly believed in the authority of God, she would have rejected that temptation. Adam's no more, he isn't innocent. He took it too. And as a result of that, now we deal with this nature, the flesh, a nature that is, we have a proclivity, we have an attraction to corrupted desires. And if we disregard and despise God's authority, we'll always give in. That's a bucket load, but I've already gone over my time, so I'm going to quit. I hope I get to connect this way next time again on So Care with Stevie Boy.